All right, thank you so much everyone for joining. I think most of the audience, they either know us or we have interacted, but still for everybody here, hi everyone, I'm Piyush. I'm one of the founders of Rio.dev. And as you would know, we work with a lot of developer tool companies. And as part of like building the community around it, building the tribe, we do these webinars. And I'm so happy we have started doing these again. We haven't done one in 2025 yet, but we did some fantastic webinars last year. We did one with Apollo GraphQL, and there we spoke with Peggy on how they leveraged the community, the open source community, to drive go to market. And I think that was like a fantastic webinars. We got some really, really good feedback there. We did one with Postman. Postman, I think, is like the OG of building a big developer adoption base and then converting that into enterprise deals. So we spoke with Sanjeev on how did Postman go bottoms up and then use that adoption to drive big enterprise deals. Then we spoke with Adam. Adam Frankel's he's been a developer marketer for a decade now. So he was at JFrog, SourceGraph, and so on. So he spoke about what should and what you should not do if your audience is developers. So we've got like a good legacy of, I think, DevTool marketers, DevTool founders talking to our audience simply about topics in DevTool GTM. And just once again to reiterate, the audience is mostly DevTool founders, DevTool go-to-market leaders, sales and marketing both. So what we plan to unpack today is a lot about the journey that you've had um, in driving go-to-market for your respective companies and functions. But before that, let me just introduce what we have today. So I think we've got Parixit and Shohil. Parixit's been in the DevTool space for a long, long time, worked at Camunda and then DeepSet driving demand gen, and now advising several startups. And we have Shohil, who's currently at Galileo. So Parikshit and Shohil, maybe we'll start with Parikshit. If you could just quickly introduce yourself, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Piyush. Really happy to be here. And hi, everyone. So I'm Parikshit. I've been working in marketing for the past 10 years. Have a background in engineering and worked across companies that have been primarily marketing to developers or interfacing with developers in some way or the other. And yeah, mostly joined teams which were super small in size, so 1 to 5 people, which eventually grew much bigger as well. So yeah, excited to kind of provide some value to all of you today.
Yep, great to meet everyone. I'm Shohil here. I've been in kind of the demand gen growth marketing space my whole career. Started at MuleSoft when we were a smaller company, and then was lucky enough to go through many phases of funding, went public, acquisition, and now back in the early stage startup space with Galileo. So I've kind of seen the different phases of growth and what you need to focus on, and excited to talk to all of you.
Awesome. Parikshit, Shohil, thank you so much. Shohil, maybe if you can just tell us a little bit about what Galileo does. And I'm sure a lot of people know about it. You've been in the news for all the right reasons. But if you could just tell us a little bit about what Galileo does, that'll put things in perspective.
Sure. Yeah, Galileo, we're in the AI evaluation space. So as you can imagine, with the kind of Gen AI wave of the last several years, there's been a lot of tooling built out, and we're specifically focused on evaluation and monitoring. So we work with companies, large global companies in the Fortune 100, all the way down to very cutting edge small startups, because as you can imagine, these AI use cases are very cross vertical and cross size as well. So we're happy to work with any companies kind of trying to understand how their AI is operating and building Gen AI applications.
Got it. And Shohil, what's your role at Galileo?
I'm our head of growth here, so my role is effectively to fill the top of the funnel and also to own our instrumentation on the marketing ops and sales ops side. And then naturally, as a small startup, we chip in where we can. So I also help with field marketing and small things here and there in terms of content and everything across marketing across the board.
Lovely. Awesome. And Joel will unpack what's worked for Galileo because I'm very, very interested to know that, as I'm sure the audience is, because like you've grown really fast. And I know it's a hot space, but there are tons of startups out there, right? And I think Galileo is one which has really stood apart. So would love to unpack what's worked for Galileo. What are two or three things that you think has really worked in your favor?
Sure. So, I mean, obviously, we can't take all the credit, right? It all starts with product, as you all well know. And one of our core advantages is that we were built for Gen AI and unstructured data from the very beginning. So it wasn't like we started doing predictive model monitoring and then pivoted to Gen AI space. We were native built. And that was a huge competitive advantage in terms of our product suite and the developer experience. And one thing that's really worked well for us from the marketing side, I would say, which I think we'll touch on later in this webinar, is being very education focused. In the Gen AI space, specifically evaluation, everyone's trying to learn from each other. The last several years were very focused on prototyping and testing. And then I would say 2024, not 2025, teams are putting their AI into production and their AI apps into production. So everyone is trying to learn how others are doing it, especially once you're in production at scale, things break, things fall apart very quickly, as everyone here knows. So we're focused on educating our core AI team audience.
Interesting. That's awesome, Shoaib. I'll come back to it in just a moment. Parikshit, if you could just tell us a little bit about your past stints at Camunda, DeepSet, that'll be awesome.
So with Camunda, it was more about, so Camunda is a company that is involved in process automation. So, so imagine if you're applying for insurance, how do you go from that first click into getting an insurance within a few minutes? So there's a lot of microservices that happen. There's a lot of like different elements that need to work. So Camunda kind of helps companies automate this process. So again, speaking very much to developers, speaking very much to solution architects, automation engineers, head of technologies, etc. So my role over there was primarily managing the MarTech, marketing infrastructure, and then also working with the demand gen team to kind of scale these offerings over time. With DeepSet, my most recent role, it's a platform to build AI application. So it also has like an open source site called Haystack. So they've developed that product, hugely successful. And here I was also responsible for the initial demand gen. And it's more, in this case, it was more about educating the whole market about how to actually develop AI applications. And then, of course, starting to find initial customers as quickly as possible.
Interesting. I think there are a couple of common themes, which is how we sort of put the theme for this webinar together. Is I think both Parishit and Shoaib have worked in the AI space a lot, right? And the space has come up in the last 3-5 years. So it hasn't been around. And in that sense, both of you have created categories. And both of you touched upon, how you can use education as a go-to-market channel. So maybe Parikshit, you want to start. How do you do that, right? What does it mean to use education as the vanguard for go-to-market?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. So firstly, I think it should really depend on the product itself. So from my experience, from my past, the products that I worked with were inherently quite complicated, and the technologies were new. So AI is like the latest one of them. So in this case, most of the times, what we would experience is that developers would be very much involved in using the product, using the open source version of the product, but then at some point hit a roadblock or not be able to complete, a certain critical task which they would really want to do with the product. So in those cases, I found having a fantastic documentation for your tool is super helpful. People love reading. People want to find out solutions on their own. It's like a natural instinct for someone working in tech. So they would rather actually go to resources, understand how, for example, how to connect your APIs and all of that through your documentation. So that's one. Another thing I found super useful, or I've seen work really well, is having those elaborate blog posts about different use cases that your product is good at. It should ideally be a part of your website, I would say, but even if not, having those posts about, okay, this is how you can solve XYZ with our product would be super helpful. And the third pillar, I think, which I heavily rely on, is having webinars like this, So you've built a nice community. Maybe you have a community on Slack, or you manage like a Discord, but constantly educating your audience about like, not just your product, but about how in the industry people are solving similar problems can be a very strong motivator for them to remember you, to keep you in mind, to understand like, hey, this is where I go to solve my problem, and it's not just another tool that I use. So, so these three pillars for me have been like pretty critical.
Parikshit, I know you have a playbook for the webinar, Do you mind sharing that? Like, how do you run webinars at DeepSet? What works for you? What would you advise? Because, and the reason I'm asking this is we know you've been very successful with that. So what's your playbook? How would you advise any of the founders or leaders here to run their webinars?
That's a very good point. So I think the first thing is the topic itself. So when a lot of times now when I speak with founders, especially, people who are more tech focused than marketing focused, it becomes a lot more about showing the technology. But I think the webinar topics, when you actually think about what do I talk about, it should be very closely connected with what problem do you solve. So I think that's the first thing. So the first thing that whenever I'm talking with someone, it's about how is this topic going to help the user, and how is it connected to the product that we are offering at this point. So it needs to be very closely connected, otherwise it'll just be like a peripheral marketing asset that you use. So that's the first one. The second one is, in order to run successful webinars, you need to have a good distribution network. And I talk about this with whenever I start a new project, is how many people can we reach right now who would be interested in hearing from you. So I think a lot of the groundwork that companies need to do initially, especially when you're a small team, when you're a early stage startup, is start building that database of people, not just by actually going and buying lists. I don't recommend that, but actually providing some kind of a content that people can either download, or maybe you have a regular newsletter, some kind of communication, even a community where people sign up to get a core audience that is actually willing to show up to these kind of events when you do them. Now, when it comes to actually running the webinar, I think the first most important thing is get straight to the point. Sometimes, especially when people are running webinars for the first time, it's very enticing to start talking about your product and your company and why you're great within the first few minutes. But I think don't give more than 5 minutes for an introduction. Introduce the speaker, get a solid speaker who actually understands the subject matter, and then just get going with that. I think the next 5 or 15 minutes should be like the problem statement, industry trends, giving some kind of context as to why this is an important challenge for you to solve. And I would say, like, from the 15-minute point onwards, I really recommend people, if you have an option, go straight into a live coding, a demo, or a workshop, show a real world implementation of the product. And again, if the more use case oriented it is, the better, and leave at least 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A and discussion. So that's kind of like a very typical setup. But the most important part, I think, comes after the webinar, which is what a lot of people miss, is what are the next steps? What do you want these people who spend an hour of their valuable time with you to do at the end of it? What do they get? Do you have a GitHub repository where you can send them? Do you have a challenge that they can complete, with something that they learned in the session? Is there a free trial that you can offer, as a special thank you for people who spend their time with you? All of these things are very important. If you have slightly longer sales cycles and you'd rather people speak with you, can you actually offer them a free consulting hour with someone from an engineering team? Can you actually show them how your product can solve the problem? And can you do this immediately after the webinar? So the next 3 steps after that 1 hour of conversation is done, for me, that is very important. 2 things I always ask people to avoid: long company pitches. Let the product show what value it offers. I think that works much better, especially with the developer audience who are not there to listen to marketing content. And don't be extremely PowerPoint heavy. Have a few slides, set the scene, but then go straight into the meat of the content.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Shohil, I want to bring you in here because I know you get what, 5,000 signups per webinar, 10,000. What's that number?
Not that often. I would say for virtual events, we're definitely in the 15,000 range. Generally, for webinars, we get about 1,300 to 1,500.
How do you get that?
It's all organic. So your database is everything. It's your treasure trove. So it's a year-round process to build your database, have quality people enter your database, obviously opt in with marketing. So your following the proper laws in different geographies. And then, of course, from there, you can nurture the database, and webinars are one very critical tool to nurture. Something Parixit said I think is very, very true is developers hate being sold to. So you have to walk a very fine line between showing your product versus selling your product. And those are kind of two different things, and it takes some balance there as well. And often I actually find you just have to be truthful, right? If you're saying this is a demo-driven webinar, you better show a product and get to it quickly. But if this is a roundtable talk with some luminary speakers and guest speakers, it's okay to be more casual. Don't even show product. Talk about their experiences and point of views, and that's fine as well, right? But as long as you're upfront about what to expect and you deliver on it, I'd say that's the most important thing there when it comes to kind of success with webinars.
Got it. I think so. I agree with your point on, getting to value quickly. But frankly, the challenge that most companies deal with is getting to a point where you can get the right people to come to your webinar.
Yeah,
So how do you get from 0 to 100 in
sure.
webinar attendees? What does that journey look like?
This is a big topic that can take a lot of time to unpack, but I would say you have to think, first of all, if you can't measure what resonates with people, you'll never know what to do. And then also you have to be testing constantly. So the way I think about it is maybe write a blog post or two, email it to your database, monitor the open rates and click rates. That'll give you a signal on what topics are interesting to people. Create more content around that specific topic. Do the same test again, see if it's still resonating. Now you have a clear signal. At that point, you can do something like bundling those blogs together into an ebook and make it a gated asset. Now use that as your anchor asset to advertise, to blast to the world in specific communities. That helps build your database, like I mentioned, right? And now with your database expanding around this specific topic, do an adjacent webinar still related to it. You'll find your registration rates are much higher because everyone in your database recently came for this topic and they'll be interested in learning more about it. And here's where you can pivot from just text to now showing something live, right? Which is a very different experience and it hooks people in. So these are kind of ways where you want to be testing, measuring, and then not being also afraid to surf what's hot. So you may have evergreen content, educational content you're always creating about your core product capabilities, but there may be themes that are very interesting to your audience at the time. For us last year, everything was about RAG, retriever augmented generation. Every AI team was building RAG apps and they wanted to know about RAG. The last 3 months to this year, everything's AI agents. That's all you hear is AI agents. So it's okay to ride the waves and see what really resonates with people and make sure you're talking about what's top of mind for them instead of dictating what you think they should care about.
Interesting. So you pick the hot topic that people care about, that people want to learn, especially
Yeah.
given the developers, they want to learn. So that advantage, I think we all have as a group, that our audience is very curious. I think the second question is, how do you build credibility, right? Do you get an external face to come and talk about it? Or do you get somebody internal, but who knows your product really well, but is probably not that big of a face? What's the
Mhm.
strategy there?
Yeah, I mean, your best case, of course, is getting an external speaker who's a well-known celebrity, whether it's through your network connections, your founder connections, your investor connections, whatever it may be. But frankly, what I find is still true. Word of mouth is the number one thing. That if you create webinars that people like, they share it. They share the recordings. They tell their coworkers, they tell other people in the communities they're with that this is a pretty good webinar. You'll find the word of mouth spreads pretty well. And we even can validate that with data, right? Because I'll send emails to our database, but then find a lot more net new people enter our database through email links because they were forwarded. That's a clear validation. What you're talking about resonates with people. So I would say, don't just worry that like I don't have a celebrity. How am I ever going to get an audience? If you're creating content that's either unique, engaging, interactive, whatever it may be, just a little different than someone else is doing, you'll find it resonates with people.
Got it. Shoil, how big is your webinar database, people who have opted in?
We're about 50,000, I would say, for marketing opted in specific people.
And how long did it take you to get there?
In about the last 2 years, I would say.
That's very impressive.
But it's a slow marathon. Don't think of it as a sprint. It's going to be a marathon. You have to accept that and go in with that mindset.
Very interesting. Parikshit, if you want to chime in, so two questions. One is if you could share some statistics just to put things in perspective. How big is the database? How long did it take to get there?
Okay, so different companies grew at different levels.
Yeah.
So without going into details about like specifically what, I would say like with the initial GTM motion, getting your first 10K or 15K could take you between like 6 months to a year and a half, like doing all of those right things. I would say give that time, be a little bit more patient. There are, of course, ways to accelerate this quite significantly. So an example is, there are publications out there, which is someone like O'Reilly, for example. So they actually give out ebooks and then you can license them. It's a very expensive bit of asset, but it is a very prized asset in the developer world, right? So if you have some kind of an asset like this, which is very closely connected with the problem that you're trying to solve again, you can license that report and use it as like a lead gen asset for your whole company. So that could really exponentially drive that growth. You could probably get to like thousands of people very, very quickly, but then you really need to put some marketing dollars behind it. But yeah, I'd give yourself like a year or so to get to that level of like genuine opted-in people. And then that you can reap those benefits actually for a very long time. So
I was going to say one thing I'd like to interject is you have to protect your database. I find a common mistake founders make is buying a cold list, importing it, and then blasting people with emails. And you will kill your sender reputation. You'll be marked spam. And it is very hard to get out of spam jail. Trust me, I've done it before, and it is a long, long, hard process. So you have to protect your database and not try to take shortcuts, even if they seem like the golden ticket and something so tempting. Just do not do it.
Got it. I agree.
100%,
It is very
100%
tempting.
agree.
And it is very tempting.
It is.
So what's in it for the big celebrity face to come and do the webinar with you? How do you convince them?
That's a tough one. Generally, it's personal relationships, I find, right? Because you need them more than they need you. That's the truth of the matter, and there's no dancing around it. So I would say either obviously it's always nice to give gift baskets and rewards or whatever it may be, but generally speaking, it's just personal relationships that's really going to drive those people coming. Now, of course, when it's a partnership or another startup or something like that, you can cross promote, go on their stuff, they come on your stuff. That's a kind of a different experience than just some celebrity kind of influencer coming onto your webinar or doing some content for you.
Have you also tried like getting people who come, who are influencers, who know this, who know their stuff, but like paying them to come on the webinar and talk about what they've learned?
I haven't tested that yet for webinars. I've used it basically influencers as distribution networks. So like I mentioned, if you're promoting a blog or ebook or I don't know, a leaderboard or something you're doing, that's I find a more effective way to use them. But also it depends on your audience, right? If you have a very broad audience where you're selling both to students and hobbyists and large enterprises, maybe you're okay with a huge mix of audience. For us, we've been very focused on mid-market and enterprise companies to this point. So really, we care about the quality more than the quantity. And just because an influencer can bring 100,000 eyeballs, it doesn't matter to us unless they're qualified eyeballs. So I think it also depends on your product and your sales motion.
Got it. Understood. So this makes sense, right? You're selling a very technical product, a product that needs to be taught to the audience. So webinars make a lot of sense, right? What else? What are the other channels that you've seen work well, like at DeepSet, at Galileo, or even in general?
You want to take that one first?
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, like, so what other channels outside of webinars, right? So I think it depends on the objective again, right? So if you're an enterprise sales company, so this is my perspective, this is what I see. If you're an enterprise sales company, in the short term, events tend to work really well. Targeted sales outreach, so some kind of an ABMish approach where you have a very specific list of companies that you're clearly outbounding to, like someone actually actively reaching out on LinkedIn, calling, stuff like that, retargeting people who are on your website, and email marketing. So these are the channels that kind of like help you push the short term, in my experience at least, or get you to a conversation. And of course, in the mid to long term with compounding benefits, that's where you get to the webinar, the roundtable, the content licensing, which I talked about, O'Reilly's. They're expensive, but they can be worth it. For open source specifically, I think there's also a natural movement from the open source community. So from your GitHub repo, and from your documentation and from your community on whatever Slack or Discord or whatever you use onto the paid product offering. So those open source users, they're a treasure trove of information, and quite a lot of them you would never know about, but you could actually, keep tracking them and find out which companies are on there. But a lot of those open source to paid product offerings are one of the best leads you will get, or pipelines you will get. So yeah.
Awesome. Shoail, anything you want to add? Like, what's worked for Galileo? Like, if you were to pick the top three channels that brought you the demand you got, what would those be?
Yeah, so for us, I would say for sure, we like to focus on our core kind of communities. So I have found AI newsletters work extremely well for us because often researchers and engineers are following specific newsletters rather than something like LinkedIn ads or Google ads or whatever it may be. So in terms of digital distribution, that's for us, that's what I find. I completely agree also on it's important to be at the right trade shows and have a booth or a presence, but often it's very expensive, right? So you have to be selective and also make sure you're tracking success. You know what's been ROI positive, what's not really been ROI positive. And we also find executive dinners work quite well. If you're selling to a larger enterprise where you're going to have a kind of an executive buyer or economic buyer, having these dinners for networking works extremely well. Versus in contrast, if you're going bottom up, it would be hackathons and meetups, right? Which is kind of two different motions, and it may be useful one way or the other for teams. But I find those work quite well actually. And there's often ones to kind of stay away from where you may be tempted to buy a billboard because you see some competitor with a billboard. I would say you have to be at the right size and understand that it's going to be tough to measure how effective it is, right? And for me as a growth marketer, both the positive and the negative is I can measure a lot of what I do, and other marketers and other functions have a tougher time. So I'm personally quite obsessed on tracking attribution and ROI measurement. So I kind of bias personally towards things where I can measure success pretty easily.
Interesting. What's not worked at Galileo?
Yeah, for us, I would say to this point, we've actually struggled with our dinners and networking events. We haven't really nailed the formula for success there. And I find some of our learnings is that it's really useful to have a partner co-promote this. So you have two different databases and audiences you're reaching out to do a dinner in a specific city, for example. Or if you have a premier VC fund you're connected with, have someone from their kind of board come and be the celebrity person, quote unquote, at the dinner. That helps quite a bit. So that's kind of a formula we're trying to nail down. But we know from speaking with kind of our partners and other kind of founders we talk to that it does work consistently, and we're starting to see the returns on this. So that's one thing we're trying to nail down. Another thing that we have not done well is hackathons, actually. Our product to this point has not been easy to get started with. We're actually rolling out our PLG motion in the coming months. So I'm both kind of learning the developer motion for Galileo as we're pivoting to be more developer focused. So we find unless it's easy to get onboarded and get going, no one wants to try your product at a hackathon, right? So that's something that we're really trying to focus on how to be better and create a better developer experience to make sure we're fruitful in those kind of activities where we're investing time and resources and people hours.
Interesting. You know what I'm not hearing at all is performance ads. Like, are you doing any of them? Are they even working?
We're dipping our toes into it, but frankly, I do not find the returns there yet, I gotta say. And I know in the past I've done a lot of retargeting ads or Google search ads, competitor focused ads, and it may seem like it works well at the click level, but when you dig down into what's generating qualified opportunities, they end up being very expensive. So I consider it a high-hanging fruit rather than a low-hanging fruit, to be honest.
Interesting. Parishit, what's your experience been with ads?
Um, like Google Ads, and I've not done them for both the companies at all. So the biggest reason for that is it is very hard to. It's great for bringing people on the website and getting them to maybe know about your look a little bit, but you'd always find like bounce rates are much higher than you'd expect. People don't fill out these forms because they don't want to get into like a sales conversation usually, and that's what typically happens once you fill out a form. So I haven't done that with both with my recent companies because the motion was different. However, where it does work and I've seen it work, is where you have a product that people can immediately try. They have like a small, um, a small value attached to it. So, a monthly cost which doesn't exceed like 10 euros or 15 euros or 20 euros. If you're selling a product like that, which is a per user, I would say give it a try. Google has some fantastic resources where you can actually see what your competitors are actually doing. So you can actually see their ads. You can see if they have been doing a lot of it. And if you see there's a lot of like similar messaging around it from your competitors, try it. But I wouldn't put too much money into it.
Interesting.
So just like Shohil said, I haven't seen like that's not my go-to channel.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, the only exception I would say is if you're focused on account-based marketing, and if you really want to hit one or two accounts, LinkedIn ads can work very, very well in that case, but you will pay an arm and a leg for it, and there's no two ways around it. So if as long as you're willing to swallow that, they can be an effective way to create awareness within specific accounts.
Got it. I think if I were to summarize this first section of this webinar, right, it's what I'm hearing is if you are selling a technical product, which is almost like a new category, education-led GTM is what's working like in your experience. And the old stuff like the ads, etc., is not yet because it's not a product that people are searching for, or it doesn't immediately resonate with you. So you got to first educate your audience, get them aware of the problem, aware of the solution, and then it might work. I think that brings us to a very interesting question that somebody from the audience asked, which is what's different for growth marketing in 2025? What do you think is going to be different this year, given this whole thing around AI is coming?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. What I find is that in the last year, let's say, there's a lot of new startups building new marketing tools from a kind of with AI workflows natively built in that are displacing the classic big bloated vendors. And you can use new tooling to do a lot more quickly. And frankly, instead of just focusing on one or two channels, now you can try four channels or different strategies with the same size team using cutting edge tooling. Now, it's not so easy to find these tools or to onboard and do all this, but that's one thing I've seen shift quite a bit where there's more power than just brute force hiring. Focus on cutting edge tooling to be more productive and more efficient. With Rio, of course, being a great example of a tool that's really amped up our outbounding success for our sales team. And our small team is now being way, way more effective at choosing the right accounts and the right people to outbound to rather than just doing a classic spray and pray approach where you're blasting 100 people with the same message.
Awesome. So, Shoal, what you're saying is the tooling is making people more productive where one person can do the job of five. So you don't need to
Yeah.
have the team. What tools come to mind? You mentioned Rio. Thank you for that. What else? What other tools come to mind?
We use several. So obviously with AI, content creation is a big kind of core competency, I would say. So we use something like Descript for video editing, Riverside for recording audio or podcasts. We use Clay for kind of go-to-market automation. There's a new tool I tried the last month, I would say, called Roadway. Very small startup, just came out of stealth, but they're doing funnel analysis and attribution with a kind of a co-pilot. So instead of creating dashboards manually, you just type in your query and it generates it for you, right? These small things can make a huge boost in productivity. And then something like Chatbase, very bare bones chatbot. And before chatbots used to be very kind of tree focused in how they respond to queries. Now with LLMs, of course, you can be dynamic, you can read your documentation, and it works really well for developers just to get their query answered, their whatever the question's answered immediately on your website, right? And these are small things that when you put them together, tie them together, it can be extremely powerful. And of course, the next level kind of gold medal status is when you use a lot more automations, whether it's Clay or Zapier to tie things together. And you might have a webinar, you trigger your automation, and suddenly it creates five different blog posts, some SEO articles, some targeted messaging for sales team to use. It reads who registered, what their questions they answered, asked in the webinar. Now you can also research their companies. So you can do these things in a very kind of quick automated way. I think go-to-market engineer is a kind of the new trendy term for it, but I find that's a big shift and there's so many tools that help do these things.
That is very cool. Shoail, what stage should a company invest in a go-to-market engineer? Seed stage, Series A, or like the first
Mm,
marketing hire should be a go-to-market engineer?
Not necessarily the first one, but I would say Series A at latest, only because they're kind of a productivity accelerant. and they will help your sales team, your marketing team, and frankly, maybe across the board, depending on how deep they're going to be working with engineers too, right? So I would say Series A is probably the right time to hire someone like that, but it is a tough role to fill because it's a brand new role. So it's more about assessing someone's curiosity, aptitude, what they like to do as a hobbyist, rather than someone's resume saying they've built something, because these are all new motions and new tooling.
Very interesting. Parishit, any AI tools that you've used that you think are really changing the game for go-to-market?
I think the basic ones, so it's more about how you use them. So I think ChatGPT has worked fantastically well for me. I rely like very heavily on tools like Perplexity and ChatGPT for creating content around any kind of campaign that we're building. Things like Canva has made it super easy, for a one-person marketing team to actually bring a campaign, into market. It's not really AI, but it has a lot of elements where you can just, prompt it to give you some kind of material for yourself. I've not tried just for AI, but there's a lot of like automations that you can do, especially around the product marketing side of it, where you can feed it your own data, and then you'd actually be able to build an entire campaign out of it. Where I see in 2025 where we're going is automation is taking like it's going to be like the next big leap for marketing teams. So I can easily see a world where 6 months down the line there's a one-person marketing team who can build an entire campaign, and it's an always-on campaign by using tools like N8N. It's a Berlin-based company that offers this. There's something called Gumloop, which I recently discovered, which lets you build like you can connect multiple applications and build an entire process out of it. And that's that's an evergreen marketing campaign. So stuff like that. So one person doing the job of like a 3 or 4 person marketing team and an initial SDR team. So that's where I see like AI being the most valuable like in the next 6 or 7 months. But I think the fundamentals don't change. So the biggest value add that large language models have given us is the ease of creating content with the human in the loop, of course. So you can't really rely on it 100% of the time, and that's a drawback. But yeah, so these tools like these about automation might be a bit more interesting, at least from my perspective.
Very interesting. I want to come to the money question now, which is how are you using AI for your GTM? What's working? Where do you think there's a good use case for AI to accelerate things in GTM?
Yeah, I would say one thing to keep in mind is a lot of existing tools have now new AI features. So it's not necessarily using brand new tools, but using, I would say, the AI features more effectively. Kind of what we touched on is content creation is the obvious one, where we're using AI to do a lot more stuff. So for us, for example, we just had our webinar on Friday. We're going to be breaking that into multiple blogs, multiple video shorts, put that across YouTube and LinkedIn. We haven't tried TikTok or Instagram yet, but obviously video shorts can live there as well. Then creating SEO content also from what you see in the transcript of the webinar. And these are just very basic, right? This is like step one, where you can get quite more advanced if you want as well. You can use a tool like 11 Labs or Well Said Labs to use AI voiceovers. So if you have a video that's interesting, let's say a 5-minute how-to video, so you don't just have to do it in English or your native language. Now you can have it in 5 or 6, 10 different languages very easily through AI. Something that would cost a lot of money 5 years ago, let's say, you can do immediately with one person. So I'd say this content creation mechanism is a very, very clear one. And then the other use case I would say is kind of the go-to-market engineering quote unquote I mentioned, where I use Clay as our toolbox, where it's really up to your imagination, right? You can plug in so many different things and use their own native agents, or you can call other LLMs to do things, and suddenly you can automate stuff with research, writing, whatever it is, right? And there's a lot of very interesting use cases I've seen with different people doing it. It can take quite a bit of time to build, and sometimes maybe doing it manually is actually quicker than trying to build something very complex. So be honest with yourself if the outcome is worth the effort. But that's kind of the two lanes I would say that we've seen AI really help us internally here at Galileo.
Interesting. Sure, you mentioned 11 labs. So that brings something that we've done, I would say, like still early days, but I think it's working out for us at Trio.dev. What we have been able to do with 11 labs specifically is create a pitch video which talks about the specific value we can add to a company. Like if I was emailing Galileo, that email goes with a video created for Galileo. which talks about how can we help companies which are in ML observability. And if that email went to a different company, which is a database, that video talks about how can Rio.dev help a database company.
Yeah.
And all of that's become possible now because now anybody can generate that. Earlier, I would have to have a team just generating those videos. So I think that's worked really well for us. Another thing that's worked really well is research because
Hmm.
the way AI has simplified research, it's incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we know, Perplexity, OpenAI, everyone releasing deep research tools in the last month, right? That alone is a shift, let alone what we'll see a year from now. So I think you always just got to be testing and trying. That's the key thing. Don't be scared to innovate, to try something new and see if it works or not. That's the only way you're gonna kind of keep your competitive advantage as a startup. I think that is the key thing. As a startup, you can try things quickly versus a larger company. It may take many, many weeks to roll out what you can roll out in 2 days.
Awesome. I think there's a question from the audience which says, do you think the role of the SDR, like how important do you think is the role of the SDR now for top of the funnel? Can that be replaced by AI? I know this is a hot topic.
I can, I guess, address that one first. It's a very both controversial and complex one because it really depends on your business, right? And as a technical product, it can be a little different than if you're selling a less technical product. I think rather than AI being ready to quote unquote replace SDRs, it's more of a tool to make them more productive, kind of some things we already touched on, right? So our SDR teams here use AI quite substantially. First, like Perplexity to do account research immediately. Also, to write customized messaging, you may have a template with some prompt engineering, and they can throw that in Perplexity or ChatGPT and come out with a personalized message now to send, right? But there's still that human thing where you want to have the human reviewing both the language, the tone, and then this human that you're sending to or reaching out to. Maybe there's specific things on their profile or your research where you might want to try a different angle, or you might want to try phone calls and LinkedIn and email, whatever it may be, right? So the SDR's core role of, I would say, building the relationship and bringing this person to the table is still a very human job, but AI can make them 10 times more productive than without AI.
Parishit, any opinion on this AI SDR?
Yeah, so I think it depending on what you set as your objective for the SDR, right? So if the objective is to just get to a meeting, probably you're better off with a human, making those initial interaction. If the objective is like capturing the audience on the website, which a lot of companies, like for example, Drip, try to do with the Q&A, right? That is where you have an enormous advantage with natural language tools like LLM-powered tools where you're not, again, on the education front, you're not trying to get them to have a conversation with you, but to help them understand a little better what your product does. I think that has definitely a lot more value, which can eventually lead to like an initial sales conversation. So if you're looking at what an SDR does, the SDRs would actually scout the market, try to find the right people to reach out to. They would actually carve out the initial message to get them interested in a conversation. They would do the initial band analysis. They would see if an AE needs to be involved in this for a traditional sales. Most of these steps you can kind of try and get through like a properly set up, SDR, AI-based SDR tool. But I would still say that's, as of this point, I would say that is the extent. One big reason for this is that it really reminds me of a time where there were chatbots everywhere. Although it was an epidemic of chatbots and really poorly created ones. That's something that I already see in the market. Like there's a lot of like poor experiences that people have on multiple websites, so that kind of puts people off a little.
I think I would actually side a lot with Shohil on this. The only companies who I see are saying AI SDRs work are the companies manufacturing AI SDRs, at least as of now. So I don't know what the future holds, but like we've tried it, we've seen so many companies try it. Nowhere have I seen AI SDRs replace an SDR. But if you're not using AI to augment your SDRs, then I think you're missing out something right now. Then you're too late
Yeah,
to the party.
I think you can apply that to almost any role in the company. If you're not using AI to augment your own work, you're gonna fall behind. It's the classic thing, right? AI will not replace a worker. It'll replace a worker that doesn't use AI. I mean, that's kind of the thing, right?
Interesting. There's another question from the audience which says, if you're cold emailing developers, what works? Does it have to be an invitation to an event or webinar, or is there anything else that can work?
I mean, I think we've already kind of discussed this. Honestly, it's education, at least for my perspective and our audience. Um, if you know what is trendy, what probably their friends or colleagues are talking about, and what's the new thing on the block, if you email them with something about that, with a nice meaty asset, very technical asset, I find that that will work very well. So here at Galileo, we have a machine learning engineer on the marketing team exclusively focused on content creation. Because he lives and breathes these problems, he knows how to speak to them and he knows what's really, top of mind, and he can write at the level of depth that's valuable rather than just something you can find on Google yourself. So I think that is kind of the secret ingredient, is to have that subject matter expert ready to create the content to communicate out to the broader world.
Very interesting. Parishit, any thoughts from your experience? Like if you were to cold outbound or cold email now, what would you send?
I'd probably not try and get them into a conversation. Definitely. Cold emails, and I would like to underline what Shohil said actually, so stuff like that is a lot better than trying to, outbound and even invite people to an event or a webinar. It doesn't work that well. But offer something in advance, offer them an asset, offer them something that will help them do their work. Maybe it's connected to your business. I think that could still lead to a good initial relationship. And I would, if you have to outbound, if you have to do cold outbounds to developers, I would guide them to a community where they can help each other, they can learn from their peers, or you build a network that is actually beneficial for everyone and not just for yourself. So that's what I would probably do if I have to cold.
Interesting. All right, I think we just have a few more questions to quickly go through. First question is, how do you get your first 10 customers as a new startup?
Yeah, I mean, it's not the best answer, but frankly, I find it really falls on founder relationships, founder networking, founder-led sales. Founder-led sales will get you the first 10 customers. And it's tough. It's a slog. I've never been a founder, so I can't speak to it personally, but I find that's the consistent thing that happens unless you're some very rare exceptional case where your product goes viral.
Yeah,
Parishit,
I think I
advice for
have to
new
agree with that.
startups.
I have to agree with that 100% as well. Like initially, founder-led sales will get you the first 10 customers. Referrals would really be important. So the first 10 customers, give them the best experience you can, or even the first customer, give them the best experience you can. And most often, you would probably find that one customer expand into a bigger customer, and then it's easier for you to retain them. I would say like the first 10 customer would come with these relationships.
Interesting. Parishit, the next question is specifically to you around what strategies have you found effective for converting open source users or open source adoption into revenue?
I think strategy doesn't change much, So at the end of the day, it's you're speaking with a developer who understands your product much better, who wants to solve a particular problem. So the biggest challenge there is how have you defined your open source versus your paid motion? So what are you offering on top? And I think that it doesn't really depend on, it's not like a strategy or something from the marketing side of it. It's more of like a strategy from like the business side. Like, hey, this is what you can build from open source. These are all the tools that you can get. You can go and build it yourself. But if you need to go enterprise, if you need security, if you need to have like a, I don't know, like some kind of agreement of like this is how quickly you'll get support and stuff like that. They need to be very well defined firstly, so that people understand what I get in open source versus not in open source. In order to get people from the open source community into the paid product, for me, it's like more about doing more of the community events, especially if you are located in a place where a lot of your audience is. Try to bring them into a room, explain to them like, hey, these are the things you can build. These are different valuable things that you can build on top of your open source offering. If you're interested in that, I think that's great. I think this is where also Rio comes into the picture quite well. So with Rio, what we have been able to do is identify larger companies that have a lot of developers on board and actually not bring the actual developer, but reach out to the business side of that particular company for for my particular products core like budget holder. So I think that approach for like outbound just by using data that we could get inside of Rio, that kind of approach works much better.
Amazing. Parikshit, again, thank you for the shout out. Is it okay to reach out to open source users? Has anybody ever told you that, like, I never asked you to reach out to me? Like, why are you reaching out?
I mean, reaching out to someone is always okay. It's about what you want to communicate with, so or communicate about. So if I go to an open source user and try to force my product and say like, hey, why don't you go and buy the full version of it, or the paid version, or buy my services, or buy my consulting, probably not the best idea. So I've never tried to do that. So no one's ever told me like why you contacted me. But I think there's a lot of doubt, especially in tech founders' minds, about like developers hate filling out forms, and developers don't like to give out their information, or developers don't want to be contacted. I think there's a little bit of an exaggeration there. So, for example, if I do a webinar and I'm promoting it to developers, I've not seen any hesitation for people to just simply sign, even if it's for just like a hackathon or something like that. And then I will always communicate on topic. So it's also always about how you can build something with this open source product, or these are the cool products that other people have built, for example, stuff like that. But yeah, a sales conversation, probably it's not even worth it, because a developer who's trying to understand and learn the product is not really the person who's going to make a structural change in the company. So for me, the goal over there is adoption, not sales. So
Interesting. I think in that sense, like selling an AI product is very similar to how developer tools have always been sold, which is education first, giving value 5 times before you ask for anything in return. And that playbook has worked for like a decade for developer tools. And I see that same playbook being implemented for AI products now. Shoil, what you mentioned about talking about RAG, talking about agentic right now, and just getting people to know how to build things. In the process, getting to know your product, your brand. And then when they have a need, they will come to you. Awesome. Shoel, Parikshit, thank you so much. One quick thing, if people want to reach out to you, what is the best way?
the same for me, just reach out on LinkedIn. Very happy to help you with any of your initial GTM questions. So
And Parikshit, I know you're working with a lot of startups. If you can just tell us what are you advising them on? What are your core areas?
So yeah, so my core areas are kind of helping you go from 0 to 1 in marketing. So that's kind of like the typical issues early stage startups face, especially if you're a tech team and you don't have any initial marketing or sales motion ready yet. The biggest challenge is, where do I start? And that's where I come in. I help you start understand how you might sell your product, what are the different areas where you should be investing your money and investing your time. I've recently also helped a startup, just do an entire webinar campaign for a new product offering. We're going to do it like early next month. So that goes from like conception and ideas of what we should be saying, to messaging, to building a distribution network, and then of course as like a host or like a panelist to actually deliver the webinar as well.
Interesting.
So I believe in like helping you execute rather than just build a strategy and let you be on your way. So that's where I can.
Superb. Parikshit, taking a leaf out of your book, can we offer our webinar attendees an hour of consulting with you for free?
Definitely reach out. Definitely reach out. I'm very happy to help, and of course for free as well. So I do not expect payment upfront or anything. Happy to share any advice. So please reach out on LinkedIn. We'll
Lovely.
definitely
Thank you
get
so
talking.
much.
Maybe we need more than an hour. You don't know.
That I leave to you and the attendee. But amazing. Thank you so much, Parikshit and Shoel. This has been amazing. We'll circulate notes from the conversation. And if there are any questions that we get post the webinar, we'll reach out to you. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I hope this was useful. Please send in your comments on what else you would like us to talk about. Who else do you think we should get on the podcast? I know AI was a big, big topic. So I was very glad we could get Shoel and Parikshit. And I hope you found this useful.